Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for DevSecOps, the good, the bad, the ugly. Today I have a good friend, Prem, and Prem is actually the Vice President of Quality Engineering. And Prem, thanks for joining me.
Hey, great to join, Zach. I think you're doing a great service to keep conversations going during this lockdown. So this is great to be part of this program.
Thanks, Prem. I find it fascinating, right? You're leading quality assurance, and you've also over the course of being with your organization, you focused on security and risk management. Can you tell me why you've tried to harmonize that with quality assurance?
Yeah, and before I joined Trilliant, one of the things that I've tried to probably share with quite a few people is moving away from this quality assurance means testing. I think there's still a very, very large association in the industry that every time you say QA, it's about testing.
Right.
So one of the first changes that I made when I joined Trilliant is to move it from quality assurance to quality engineering, to say, how do we really engineer quality across the life cycle? So that we make it very clear that quality is a shared objective. It's not about testing cycles and different flavors of testing and all the tools that go with it. All those are still important tools. Again, I'm not against testing, but I think you can create much better value, build quality in much sooner if there is a collective approach to quality across dev, ops, as well as anybody else who's a product manager, for example. So how do you bring the business side of a company together along with the technical side so that we can deliver solutions that focus on quality? So that's the big goal of, initially a few folks thought I was just relabeling something to put my stamp on my role to say move something from QA to QE. But there was a real intent for doing that, because the goal was, how do you drive that mindset? How do you drive a set of behaviors that are focused on building quality in throughout the life cycle and looking at quality as a shared objective or a set of shared objectives. And then along those lines, I also wanted to make sure that the way the customer looks at it, they don't really care if you have a QE team and a security team and then a risk management team and whoever else. Ultimately, they want to make sure that they're getting a solution that meets their expectations, but it also meets expectations regarding standards and compliance and anything else that need to go with it. So quality, in my mind, takes on a much bigger role than just talking about, okay, we met the requirements, or we met only functional requirements, but not functional. Or we met functional and non-functional, but security is somebody else's problem. We can't afford to do that. So if you really say that here is a solution that has gone through adequate due diligence and we trust the quality of what we deliver, that has to be much more comprehensive than meeting functional requirements in a well-tested solution. It needs to be secure, it needs to perform, it needs to scale, it needs to meet basic user experience expectations. So the only way to package all that together is to bring quality, security, risk management under one umbrella and look at it more comprehensively than what is traditionally done, as each piece is divvied up to somebody and that person needs to do their job. And we hope that those two or three people come together and it all works well. So we surely wanted to do away with that assumption. And then how do we bring this together? And it also helps the team to look at, so many times we use phrases like risk-based decisions or risk-based testing, but risk management itself is much more beyond risk-based testing. So how do you bring a risk-based culture or risk-driven decision-making as part of the organization's culture? The only way is to bring quality, security, risk management, everything under one umbrella. Look at it as, how do you deliver a quality solution that is also secure, that performs well, that scales, that meets user experience. So that's really what's the driver.
Yeah, no, that's great, Prem. And one of the areas that you implemented at Trilliant was open source governance, right? You created the policies around that. So being a QA person, right? I know you just gave an overview of really your philosophy there, but why was open source governance something that was of importance to you?
This is the use of open source, whether you look at it from an API perspective or any of the third-party libraries, that's a big deal today because companies like Netflix are offering a whole suite of third-party code, third-party libraries that many organizations use today. And it saves a lot of time. It's already been used by somebody. It's been vetted by somebody. It's been used so many times. So we know that you don't have to invest time internally to build the same stuff unless there is a very good reason to. But that also, in a very Spider-Man-like language, when you take on that additional ownership, it also comes with some responsibilities. So you can't say that, okay, I'm going to save a ton of time. Let me go and source this third-party library, which saves a ton of time. It brings me a wealth of new opportunities within the organization. But it's equally important that you're bringing in third-party libraries. You're also bringing in vulnerabilities associated with it. So you want to make sure that there is a good governance process internally. And the teams are also well aware and educated on what are some best practices or good practices to follow when you're using these third-party libraries. So that's really the reason for telling people that, yes, we certainly support that path forward, but we want to make sure that there is a clear policy around open source. There's some governance built around it. And we also educate and train people to make sure that they follow those good practices.
Yeah. So when you built out your practices, right, at Trilliant, Prem, can you share about some of the lessons and learns, maybe some of the challenges that you experienced along the way, and how do you improve from those?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of lessons learned, but the one that I would certainly highlight is realizing that this governance cannot be a manual process. So you cannot have a governance process where you run a scan and then that scan produces a report. That report is filed away as a CSV or Excel in some SharePoint, and then expect somebody during their so-called free time to go and look at that report and take some meaningful and timely action. We realized very early that that wouldn't work. Yes, we started there because obviously anybody would like to get the most efficient governance process at the least cost. So just like any other team, we pursued that, but very quickly realized that that's not going to work. And the goal of governance is not to create more Excels and PowerPoints to keep throwing to different stakeholders, but the goal is how do you really do a quick assessment of risk from that governance process? How do you make sure that the mitigating actions are implemented quickly? And if there are some corrective actions, lessons learned stemming out of it, how do you act on it quickly? So that's the goal. Yeah. So we realized through that early lessons learned that we have to automate this process.
Right.
That the governance and the checks and the gating has to be built into our solution delivery pipeline. Yeah. And the only way to do that is automate more, build it at different checkpoints throughout the build process, and make it as seamless as possible to the dev team. So they don't look at it as, I have to stop 4 times to do some governance checks and then continue.
Right.
So even if there is some enthusiasm early on, it's very clear that that's not going to be sustained because like every company, you go through those peaks and valleys, you get into some really aggressive timelines, and you can't expect that everybody is going to pause at those 4 intervals, do their due diligence, and then go forward. So automation was key.
Yeah.
I would say the biggest lessons learned was automate early, automate continuously, and the more you can integrate it with your delivery pipeline and the life cycle, the odds of success are much higher.
Yeah, no, that's great, Prem. So another area that I wanted to zero in on that's a concern for organizations, right? Or even sometimes developers, like, hey, if my manager actually finds out all the libraries that I'm using, or when an organization starts to scan for these, vulnerabilities associated with the dependencies they're using, there's going to be a lot. Right, there's going to be a lot of risk for them to begin to assess. How would you recommend from that starting point of getting that visibility, like you talked about, where you're getting it on a spreadsheet, to saying, how do we now start empowering developers? What do you recommend that they focus on first?
So it's very important. As much as developers might not enjoy reading legalese and 15-page policy documents, but
Right.
I think it's really important to sit with them and explain the big picture of we are fully supportive of the direction that we are taking with the use of open source or third-party libraries. But what is the risk of not having adequate governance? What is the risk of not exercising due diligence? What is the risk to the customer? What is the risk to the company? Whether it's in terms of financial penalties or whether it's in terms of any other embarrassing situations that we have to go through. But for them to understand that big picture is extremely important. So that again, there is a higher probability of them supporting that initiative rather than presenting it as we are switching from tool A to tool B. Tool B is much better, so just go with it. It's built into our pipeline. So all that is important, but it's very important for them to get the context of what they're doing, why they're doing, why does it matter to them, why does it matter to the company, why does it matter to the customer. And I just very recently read one of Sonatype's, I think it was called the community survey.
Mm-hmm.
Among many things, one thing that's certainly highlighted the importance of culture and the kind of investment of time that managers make in driving that cultural change is so important. I think it said something to the effect of happy developers will support the change much more compared to anybody else. And I think, again, the so-called happy can mean many things. But at the very least, I think there needs to be a connection between the developers understanding why they're doing what they're doing. They shouldn't perceive it as, okay, one more layer of work added to them.
Right.
So we're certainly trying to make it much easier on them by building it into the pipeline, by building it as an automated process. So there's not too many things that's disruptive to their work. But the more they understand the big picture and they understand that they are contributing to that risk mitigation within the organization, helping the customer, helping the company. I think that's very important. It's important to invest that time up front and get any questions answered, any concerns answered, especially since we were moving from a one way of doing things to an automated way. If somebody, and there would always be a few skeptics to say that, yeah, we tried something for 2 years, it didn't work. How do you think this is going to be different? Why do you think this should work? Be prepared to answer those questions. Be patient to answer those questions. But because as much as this is about transitioning to a tool and transitioning to automation, but I think in a indirect way, you're also shaping a culture of
Absolutely.
due diligence within the company.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, yep, absolutely. So Prem, the last question that I wanted to ask you, maybe if you can talk about, without getting into tooling and all that, but talk about the specific areas where you feel like it's important to get that feedback to the developer. I mean, is it at the procurement process when they're pulling the libraries in? I mean, how are you trying to make sure that you put that into the life cycle? Maybe some tangible examples of areas that you find to be something that you're focusing on.
Yeah. And again, a very popular term in the industry is shift left. Now, shift left, again, can be interpreted in so many different ways. So is shift left about building quality early in the life cycle? Is shift left about building security early? Is it about testing early? I mean, different folks might have different interpretations of what shift left means. But I think as a general rule, what I'm trying to build within the company is can the earlier that we find risk to the customer or risk to the company and implement mitigating steps or corrective actions, I think the better we are, not just from a cost perspective, so that that risk doesn't manifest itself as one or more issues, and then we get into firefighting mode. Right. So as a general rule, so whether you look at it from a quality perspective, security perspective, environment perspective, what can we plan early? How do we build that early? So from an open source perspective, even as we identify, so the first step that we took was to write a very simple policy and had a lunch and learn session where we walked through that policy, had questions answered. And one of the expectations that we set up front is we want to make sure that when we have a set of approved third-party libraries that has already been vetted, that's gone through our life cycle a couple of times. Mm-hmm. So if somebody brings in a new library because they heard it through a friend or based on some research that they did,
Right.
what's the process that we would follow to bring that into our set of libraries that we want to use?
Right.
What controls we use? How would the tool flag any issues there, and what steps do we have to take?
Mm-hmm.
And once we bring the tool in, assuming we've done all the early vetting that we have to do, everything looks good. But once we start using it on a very specific scenario for a customer, if there are vulnerabilities identified by the tool, flagged as critical or major, or based on some flagging, how would you respond to it? Why is it important to do those periodic reviews and make sure we take actions timely? Again, this is not a reporting aspect. This is more about risk management. So why is it important to identify those issues and then respond and take corrective actions immediately? So again, from an open source governance perspective, the shift left really starts with identifying third-party libraries. And why is it important to identify any issues early, get them mitigated? Or if we entirely decide that for various reasons, this is not a library that we want to bring into our environment, and we have some good reasons for doing that, then flag it right there. Let it not even get through our pipeline and then get flagged in the third step or the fourth step. We want to stop that in the first step itself. Yeah. Now, once it got through the first step, then yes, we have controls built in at different stages in the life cycle, and we can identify those. Then the responsibility shifts from just the due diligence of flagging the library to what are those vulnerabilities. And you might run into some things that are flagged by the tool as a vulnerability, but the severity of the vulnerability or the impact of the vulnerability could be different than what the tool had perceived and what we really think the impact on the customer is. But that dialogue needs to happen. People need to take the time and do it.
Right.
Just because something is flagged by the tool as a low impact, we don't ignore it. We need to at least do a sample review to ensure that the way the policies have been set up, the way the rules have been set up are working as intended. The number of false positives are significantly going down, and we can get the automation process to really work the way we want it to.
Yeah.
So I think again, the general principle of shift left and what that means is how can we start early? So all the way from identifying the libraries, and once a library is identified and put into our pipeline, how do we build some controls at different stages in the life cycle? And I mean, there is still a manual effort there in terms of folks getting together to review the results, make timely decisions. But I think it's a very good investment to make.
That's great. That's great, Prem. Hey, appreciate you coming on and chatting with me. I know we're all working from home these days, and definitely enjoyed the conversation, being able to reconnect with you.
Yes, same here, Zach. Thank you.